It had been a month since I lost Emily. A month since the world, once filled with the promise of love and the joy of expecting our first child, had come crashing down into an abyss of grief and confusion. I found myself returning to the cemetery, like a ritual I couldn't avoid, standing by her grave as I had so many times before. The air was crisp, biting in the way it always is in early autumn, but I barely felt it. My heart was heavy, weighed down by sorrow and memories. I brought fresh flowers this time, though the task felt pointless. It wasn't that I didn't want to remember her, of course I did, but nothing could fill the void left by her absence. Emily had been everything to me. Her laugh, the way her eyes sparkled when she spoke about the future, the quiet moments we shared just holding each other in silence. I still saw it all as if it had happened only yesterday. I couldn't believe she was really gone. And the child she had carried. Our child. Taken too soon. I stood there, lost in my thoughts, when I felt a strange shiver run down my spine. My mind, tangled in memories of the life we'd lost, could have easily played tricks on me. Yet, there she was. A figure stood at the edge of the cemetery, just beyond the cluster of gravestones where Emily rested. She was a woman. A figure I knew too well. For a split second, I thought it was Emily, standing there as if nothing had changed. Her long, dark hair swayed gently in the breeze, the same way Emily's had. She was dressed in the same shade of blue, so familiar it was as if she'd stepped right out of my memories. I felt my heart race, and I took a few hurried steps forward. Emily, my voice cracked. But before I could get any closer, she turned and walked quickly toward the shadow of the old oak tree near the back of the cemetery. I tried to call out again, but when I reached the spot where she had been standing, there was no one. The tree stood silent, the wind rustling the leaves, but there was no trace of her. My breath caught in my chest, and I stood frozen for a long moment, staring into the empty space where she had been. Was it her? Was I imagining things? I had been to this grave so many times, talking to her in my heart, telling her everything that had happened since she left. Could my grief have played tricks on me, bringing her back to my eyes even though she was no longer there? I didn't know. The line between what was real and what wasn't felt increasingly blurred. Maybe I had been staring too long at the gravestone, the same words etched into the cold stone, unable to escape the truth of her death. Or maybe, just maybe, I had been hoping so desperately for some kind of sign that the universe had finally decided to show me something I could understand. I sat down on the grass, the soft dampness of the earth grounding me to the moment. As I placed the flowers carefully on the grave, the weight of the situation crashed down on me once again. The pain of losing her, the child, and everything we had dreamed of together, seemed unbearable. The ache of it. The emptiness. It was a hole I couldn't fill. But that brief moment of seeing her, whether real or imagined, stayed with me, lingering in my mind like a question I couldn't answer. Had I seen her? Or was it just the madness of grief playing tricks on me? I thought about what I'd seen and then closed my eyes, trying to calm my thoughts. Maybe it was just the loneliness of being there, the quietness of the cemetery, the coldness of the stone. Maybe it was all just my mind, grasping at anything that would bring me peace. But a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a hallucination. The feeling that, somehow, Emily had reached out to me in that fleeting moment. I felt connected to her, as though she hadn't really gone. It was hard to explain, but it was there, this sensation that she was still out there, in some form I couldn't fully comprehend. I lingered at the grave for a while longer, the shadows beginning to stretch across the ground as the day slowly shifted to evening. As I stood up to leave, I glanced back one last time, expecting to see nothing more than the empty grave and the windswept grass. But for a brief moment, I could have sworn I saw her again, just the faintest glimmer of a figure in the distance. It vanished quickly, but the vision, if it was a vision, felt real. More real than anything had felt in the past month. I walked away slowly, my heart heavy with confusion and longing. the uncertainty lingering in my chest. The world was quiet. Too quiet. As if it were holding its breath, waiting for me to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. Not yet. At least. I didn't know what I had seen or if it was anything more than a desperate wish. But the ache of loss didn't ease. And I couldn't help but wonder if I would ever find peace in the chaos of grief that swirled around me. As I walked toward the car, I thought about Emily once more. I thought about what we had lost. What I had lost. And I wondered if, somehow, this vision was a sign. Or perhaps just a way for me to keep holding on to something. Anything. That felt like her. But for now, I had to keep going. There was no other choice. Life, like it always does, moves on. Even when it feels impossible. But Emily's memory stayed with me. And maybe, just maybe, there was more to her story than I knew. The mystery of it was just beginning. The next morning, I couldn't shake the image of the woman from the cemetery from my mind. Emily, or whoever she had been, kept returning to my thoughts. It had been a restless night. The kind of night where your dreams are full of things you can't quite understand. And when you wake, you feel more lost than you did when you went to sleep. I tried to make sense of what I had seen. But nothing felt clear. Maybe I was still grieving too deeply. My mind tricking me into believing things that weren't real. Maybe the longing for Emily's presence was so strong that I'd conjured her out of sheer desperation. But I couldn't ignore it. Not entirely. So, I decided to return to the cemetery. I told myself it was just to visit Emily's grave again. To bring more flowers. But in the back of my mind, I wondered if I might see the woman again. The vision that had shaken me to my core. I needed to understand what had happened. Maybe there was an answer out there. Something that would help me make sense of all the confusion. When I arrived, the cemetery was eerily quiet. As it often was in the early morning, I could hear the soft rustling of the leaves in the wind. The quiet chirping of birds that didn't seem to notice the heaviness in the air. I stood by Emily's grave for a long while, my fingers trailing over the cool stone. But then something caught my eye, and everything changed. At the foot of Emily's grave, there was something strange. A bundle of cloth, tucked carefully on the ground. At first, I thought it was just an old blanket someone had discarded. But as I drew closer, my heart skipped a beat. There, lying quietly amidst the flowers and the cold earth, was a baby. A small, fragile baby. No more than a month old. Wrapped in a faded blue blanket. I stood frozen for what felt like an eternity. Staring at the tiny creature before me. The world around me seemed to vanish. And all I could hear was the rushing of blood in my ears. My first instinct was to pick the baby up. To hold it close and make sure it was safe. But I couldn't move. The confusion inside me was overwhelming. How could this be? This child. This tiny being. Looked so familiar. It was impossible to ignore the striking resemblance it bore to Emily. The same dark eyes. The same delicate features. The same soft skin. It was like staring at a piece of her. Something I had lost. But here it was. Alive and breathing. In front of me. I knelt beside the baby. Trembling. My mind was racing. Trying to process what I was seeing. There had to be an explanation. Emily had been pregnant when she died. I had held her hand through her sickness. I had promised her that we would raise our child together. How could this baby be here now? Where had it come from? My heart was pounding as I gently lifted the baby into my arms. The child seemed to be sleeping, calm and peaceful, utterly unaware of the storm of questions that was building inside me. How had it gotten here? Why had it been placed on Emily's grave? Was this some kind of cruel joke? A twisted reminder of everything I had lost? I looked around, desperate for answers. But there was no one in sight. The cemetery was as quiet as ever. The only sounds the soft flutter of the leaves. I stood up, holding the baby, feeling the weight of this strange discovery. It was too much. Too impossible to comprehend. I needed help. I needed someone to explain this. I rushed to the caretaker's office, hoping to find some clue, some explanation. Mr. Thompson, the cemetery caretaker, was an old man who had worked there for as long as I could remember. He had always been kind to me, but as I entered the small, dimly lit office, I saw the familiar furrowed brow on his face, the kind that suggested he was just as lost as I was. Mr. Thompson. I don't know what to say. There's a baby. A baby at Emily's grave. He looked at me for a moment, his expression unreadable. A baby? His voice was low, as though he was weighing his words carefully. Yes. A baby. A month old. Maybe younger. I don't understand. How did it get there? I was practically pleading, my hands trembling as I held the child close. I needed answers. I needed something to hold on to. The caretaker stood up slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. I don't know what to tell you, son. No one's been here. Not that I've seen. But sometimes things happen around here that can't be explained. His words didn't bring me any comfort. In fact, they only added to my confusion. I couldn't leave the cemetery without answers. I looked at Mr. Thompson again, hoping for more, but he didn't offer anything further. I'll have to take the baby to the clinic. Maybe they'll know something. The caretaker didn't respond. He simply nodded, as if the situation was something he had long given up trying to understand. I left quickly, cradling the baby in my arms, my mind still reeling from the bizarre and terrifying discovery. I had to know how this was possible. What had happened to Emily? Was there something more to her death than I could ever have imagined? The answers, whatever they were waiting. But I had no idea just how deep the mystery went. I drove to the clinic with the baby still cradled in my arms, the soft weight of the child almost grounding me, but also deepening my confusion. How could I be holding this baby, who looked so much like Emily, when Emily herself was gone? I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, to focus on the immediate need, the answers I had to find. Dr. Tommy, a good friend of mine, worked at the local clinic. He had been there through some of my most difficult moments during Emily's pregnancy, through all of her medical scares, and most recently, after her death. He knew the details of our life better than anyone else. I trusted him, and I hoped, maybe foolishly, that he could offer some explanation for the strange events that had unfolded in the past 24 hours. As I entered the clinic, my steps slow and hesitant, I saw Tommy behind the desk. His face was kind, as always. But today there was a faint line of concern etched into his forehead, a sign that something was off. I approached him, trying to steady myself. Tommy, I need your help, I said, my voice strained, barely able to disguise the urgency I felt. This baby was left on Emily's grave. I don't know how it got there, but it looks so much like her. I need you to help me figure out what's going on. Tommy blinked, momentarily stunned. Wait. What? He pushed back from his desk, standing up as though to process what I was saying. You're telling me this baby was at the cemetery? Yes, I replied, holding the baby out slightly, as if to show him the undeniable evidence. I don't know what to think. Emily died a month ago. She was pregnant. And now this child is here. And I don't know why. Tommy took a deep breath, looking at the baby with a mix of confusion and concern. I'm not sure what to say. Jordan, this doesn't make sense. You know I can't just give you answers like that. I know, I said quickly, but I need you to run a DNA test. I need to know if this baby is Emily's. If it is, then something is really wrong. Tommy, something is wrong with the story I've been told. Tommy hesitated, his gaze darting back and forth between me and the baby. His usual calm demeanor was rattled, and I could see the ethical dilemma weighing on him. He was a doctor, and I was a friend. What I was asking him to do wasn't standard procedure. But I wasn't asking for a medical diagnosis, I was asking for answers to something that felt far beyond the realms of logic. "Jordan," Tommy said, after a long silence, "you know this is tricky, right? It could take weeks for a formal test to come back. You don't want to risk rushing it." "I can't wait weeks," I replied, my voice growing more desperate. "Tommy, please. You know I need to know. I need to understand what happened." He sighed, rubbing the back of his neck, clearly torn. After a long pause, he spoke again. "Okay, I'll run the test. But you have to promise me you'll go through the proper channels if it turns out this baby is yours. We can't just keep this off the books." I nodded eagerly, relieved that Tommy had agreed to help. "I'll do whatever it takes. Tommy, I just need to know the truth." Tommy seemed to sense the depth of my need for answers, and he moved to another room to prepare the necessary materials for the test. I sat in the sterile waiting area, the baby asleep in my arms, feeling the weight of the situation settling heavily over me. I kept glancing down at the child, my thoughts in a haze. How could this be happening? Emily's absence still felt like a raw wound. And now I was being forced to confront the possibility that she hadn't just died, she had left behind something that I couldn't explain. I couldn't shake the thought that maybe the truth was more sinister than I'd ever imagined. Tommy returned shortly, and we quickly went through the steps to collect the samples. The baby was calm, unbothered by the procedure. It almost felt like a dream, surreal and strange. I knew that whatever came back from the test would change everything. If the baby was mine, then my world, already shattered, would become even more unrecognizable. And if it wasn't, then what? What was the alternative? "We'll get the results as soon as we can," Tommy said, his voice quiet, as if sensing the weight of the moment. "I'll contact you as soon as I know anything." I nodded, clutching the baby closer to my chest as I stood to leave. "Thank you, Tommy. I don't know what I would have done without you." I left the clinic in a daze, the world around me feeling oddly distant, as though I were moving through it in a fog. The question of Emily's death, of the mysterious baby, gnawed at my mind. Whatever happened next would change everything. I had to know what the truth was, no matter how painful or unimaginable it might be. The days that followed were a blur. I went about my routine as if I were still living in the world I knew before Emily's death. But every moment felt hollow, like I was drifting through life on autopilot. The baby, this strange link to Emily, occupied my every thought. I could barely eat, couldn't sleep without the constant echo of the unanswered questions pressing in on me. Was this child really mine? If so, what had happened to Emily? Then, the call came. It was late in the evening when Tommy's number flashed on my phone. My heart raced as I picked up, the uncertainty suffocating me. "Jordan," Tommy said on the other end, his voice steady but carrying a weight I wasn't prepared for. "The results came back. It's yours. The baby is yours. Jordan." I felt the words crash into me, and for a moment, the world seemed to stop. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto the couch, the baby in my arms still and oblivious to the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just that the baby was mine, it was the implications of it. How could Emily have died a month ago if this child was hers and mine? How could she have been gone? And yet here I was, holding a living, breathing part of her. "Are you sure?" I asked, the question tumbling out of my mouth before I could stop it. Tommy's voice softened. "Yes, Jordan. I ran the test twice. There's no mistake." I sat there in stunned silence, staring down at the baby. A new weight settled over me, not just the grief and confusion that had been eating away at me for weeks, but a sense of responsibility. I was a father. Somehow, I was a father. And yet, Emily was gone. How could I care for this child when I was still haunted by the ghost of her absence? "Thank you, Tommy," I finally said, my voice barely above a whisper. He hesitated before replying. "Jordan, You need to take action. This isn't just about you anymore. There's something more going on here. And you need answers. You have to find out what happened to Emily. His words rang in my ears long after I hung up. What happened to Emily? What had happened to my wife? The woman I'd loved. The woman who had promised me a future. And why? Why had she left me with this child? This living reminder of everything I had lost. I knew what I had to do next. I couldn't keep waiting, hoping for some sign, some explanation that would make sense of all of this. I had to find out the truth. And if I had to dig into the dark corners of the past, I would. The next morning, I drove to the police station. The baby was with me, strapped into the back seat. A small, helpless figure who had no idea the storm that was brewing around her. As I parked in front of the station, I took a deep breath, steeling myself. This wasn't going to be easy, but I couldn't let fear stop me from uncovering the truth. Inside the station, I was met with the usual bureaucratic indifference. The officers were polite, but their eyes were skeptical when I explained why I was there. I told them about the baby, about the DNA test, and the strange events that had been unfolding since Emily's death. I expected them to take me seriously, but they didn't. They brushed me off with a few polite nods and assurances that everything was in order, that there was nothing to worry about. When I insisted that I had seen Emily alive at the cemetery, when I told them about the vision, the moment that still haunted me, they looked at me like I was losing my mind. One detective even suggested that I might be imagining things, that my grief was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't let it go. Something's wrong, I said, my voice rising with urgency. Emily didn't just die. There's something more to this. And I won't stop until I know what happened. I need you to look into it. They promised they would. But I knew deep down they were humoring me. The case was closed. Emily was dead. The funeral had been attended. They had no reason to believe anything more was amiss. But I knew. I knew something wasn't right. Something about this whole situation, about Emily's death, about the baby, felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I had to find out what had happened. Not just for me, but for the child who would now depend on me. Leaving the station, I felt more determined than ever. The investigation wasn't going to be easy, but I had to follow the thread wherever it led. I owed it to Emily, to the baby, and to myself. Whatever had happened, whatever truth was buried beneath this twisted story, I was going to uncover it. And nothing was going to stop me. The drive from the police station was quiet. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles white. I couldn't shake the feeling of being dismissed, of my concerns being brushed aside as if they were nothing more than the ravings of a grief-stricken man. I had hoped for some kind of breakthrough, even the smallest indication that someone would take me seriously. But instead, I had been met with polite skepticism. My mind was a storm of confusion and frustration. How could they just close the case like that? How could they simply accept the explanation that my wife had died and that everything was over? I knew, deep in my gut, that there was more to this story. But the police had made it clear they didn't believe me. To them, the case was settled. The evidence was clear. Sherry was gone. But I couldn't accept it. I couldn't just let her memory fade into the pages of a police report. I had to find the truth. As the days passed, I began to feel more and more like I was fighting an invisible battle. The baby was with me constantly, her cries a stark reminder that I wasn't in this alone. And yet, I felt utterly alone in my quest for answers. I had no one to turn to for help. No one who believed that something strange was unfolding in my life. I turned to the one place I thought might offer some answers, Sherry's family. It had been a while since I'd last seen her parents, Thelma and Gerald. The memory of our last visit to their house was still vivid, how polite they had been. But how guarded they had always seemed. Sherry had grown up in a tight-knit, protective family, and though they had never made me feel entirely welcome, I had always tried to maintain a good relationship with them. But now, with everything that had happened, I felt like I was facing an entirely different set of people. Sherry's family had to know something. They had to. I packed the baby into the car, her tiny body wrapped in a blanket, and drove to their home in North Carolina. The familiar route felt strange now, like I was heading into uncharted territory. Each mile felt heavier than the last, as if the weight of the unanswered questions was pressing down on me, adding more tension with every turn. When I arrived, Thelma greeted me at the door. She looked as though she had been expecting me, but there was a coolness in her eyes, a wariness I couldn't ignore. "Jordan," she said, her voice tight but polite. "I didn't expect to see you so soon. I didn't waste time with pleasantries." "Where's Gerald?" I asked, looking past her into the house. "I need to talk to both of you." Thelma stepped aside, motioning for me to enter. But there was something about the way she moved that felt off. She wasn't welcoming me as she once had. Instead, she seemed to be waiting for something, perhaps an argument, perhaps a confrontation. It was clear that something had shifted between us. Gerald appeared in the living room shortly after. He was in his late 50s, a stern man whose gaze could be sharp as a knife when he chose to let it. His expression was neutral, but I could see the tension in his jaw. I didn't beat around the bush. "There's something you need to tell me," I said. "I found the baby at Sherry's grave, and the DNA test proves she's mine. But there's more to this than just that. Sherry, she didn't die. I saw her alive." "What happened?" "Gerald." The room went still. Thelma's face went pale, her hands fidgeting nervously at her sides. Gerald's face, however, remained unreadable. For a moment, there was no response, just an eerie silence that hung in the air. Then Gerald spoke, his voice cold and dismissive. "You're wrong, Jordan," he said, his words laced with contempt. "Sherry is gone. We buried her. There's nothing more to it." I took a step forward, desperate for some shred of truth. "You're lying," I shot back. "I saw her at the cemetery. She was alive. And you know it. What have you done? What did you do to her?" Gerald's eyes hardened, and his voice dropped to a low growl. "I've had enough of this nonsense. Sherry is dead. And you're making a fool of yourself." His words stung, but I couldn't back down. "You're lying, Gerald. I know it. Why else would I find this child at her grave, looking exactly like her? And why do you seem so desperate to deny everything?" There was a flicker of something in Gerald's eyes, fear, perhaps, or guilt, but it was gone before I could analyze it. "This has nothing to do with you," he muttered, his anger rising. "Stop asking questions you don't want the answers to." I felt the walls closing in, the weight of the truth pressing harder than ever. Gerald's hostility was evident, and Thelma's unease made it clear that they were hiding something they didn't want me to know. But I wasn't backing down. Not now. Not when I was so close to the truth. The tension in the room was unbearable. The words I had exchanged with Gerald had felt like slaps, each one more painful than the last. His dismissal, the way he tried to sweep away the questions I had about Sherry's death, left me reeling. But I couldn't give up. There had to be an explanation for everything, and I was determined to find it, no matter how deep the lies ran. Thelma, her face flushed with anxiety, stepped toward me cautiously. Her eyes darted to the baby, who had begun to fuss in my arms, and then back to me. Her reluctance was palpable, but there was a glimmer of something like guilt or fear, shining through her normally composed demeanor. "Jordan," she said, her voice low and tremulous. "You need to stop. You don't know what you're asking." But I couldn't stop. My heart thudded painfully in my chest, the pull of truth dragging me deeper into this web of deceit. Sherry was alive. I knew it. I had seen her with my own eyes. And now the baby was here. The undeniable evidence that something was horribly wrong. "I'm not going to stop until I know the truth," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Where is Sherry? Thelma, where is she?" For a long moment. There was nothing but the sound of the baby's soft crying and the sharpness of my breath. Then, as if a dam had finally broken, Thelma spoke. Her words barely a whisper. She's been hiding, she confessed. Her hands trembling as she wrung them in front of her. Gerald, he's been controlling her. He told her that you died. Jordan. He made her believe that you were gone. That you wouldn't come back for her. He locked her away. Isolated her from everyone. I felt as though the floor had been ripped out from beneath me. The words didn't make sense. Yet they made perfect sense all at once. Sherry. The love of my life. Trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Cut off from the world by the very people who should have been protecting her. Why didn't you tell me? I demanded. My voice cracking with a mixture of anger and hurt. Why didn't you come forward sooner? Thelma's face twisted with sorrow. We tried. Jordan. But Gerald, he's powerful. And he manipulated all of us. We were afraid of what he might do. We didn't know how to stop him. It was like a weight had been lifted from my shoulders. But only to be replaced by something far heavier: grief, regret, anger, and a sense of helplessness I had never known. How could this have happened? How could Gerald have done this to Sherry? To all of us? We need to get her, I said urgently, the resolve in my voice hardening. We need to get Sherry out of there before it's too late. Thelma nodded. But there was a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. It's not that simple. Jordan. Gerald, he won't let her go. If we try to take her, he'll fight us. He's dangerous. The mention of Gerald's danger only fueled the fire in my chest. I couldn't sit idly by while Sherry suffered. I had to act. And I had to act fast. Then we'll do it together, I said firmly. We'll bring her back. Thelma hesitated. Then sighed. As though the weight of the decision was too much to bear alone. She finally nodded. Her eyes meeting mine with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. We'll need help, she said quietly. There's only so much we can do on our own. I agreed. But my mind was already racing ahead. Thinking of what needed to be done. This was no longer just about finding the truth. This was about saving Sherry. I looked at the baby in my arms. Despite everything that had happened, there was still one thing that kept me grounded: the child. She was my flesh and blood. And she was all I had left of Sherry. The thought of her growing up without her mother, without the love and care that Sherry had always promised to give her, was unbearable. We'll do whatever it takes, I said. Determination flooding through me. I won't lose her again. Thelma nodded once more. Her face hardening with a newfound resolve. Together, we would rescue Sherry from whatever hold Gerald had on her. There was no turning back now. We left the house. The baby still in my arms. And I couldn't help but glance back toward the door. Behind it lay the answers I so desperately needed. And beyond it, the woman I loved, who had been kept hidden from the world for far too long. But now, there was hope. I would bring Sherry back. And no one, least of all Gerald, was going to stop me. We drove in silence for a while. The weight of everything pressing down on me like an immovable stone. The baby's soft breathing in my arms. The only sound breaking the silence. Felt like a fragile reminder of the innocence that had been tangled up in all of this chaos. I couldn't help but think of Sherry, wondering what she was going through in that house. Hidden away. As her family continued to lie about her whereabouts. The plan was clear: we had to confront Gerald. No matter the cost. Thelma was on edge. Her nerves fraying as we approached the mansion. I could see her wringing her hands in the rearview mirror. A quiet tremor betraying the calm facade she was trying to maintain. Are you sure about this? She asked. Her voice filled with doubt. I'm sure, I replied. My voice as firm as I could make it. We have no other choice. We can't keep waiting. The mansion loomed ahead. Its dark, imposing silhouette casting an eerie shadow across the landscape. The large gates at the front looked as though they had been built to keep people out. But to me, they might as well have been a symbol of the cage Sherry had been trapped in for so long. I clenched my jaw and pushed aside the thoughts of how wrong this all was. There was no time for hesitation. We parked in front of the house, and my heart began to race. I could feel the adrenaline surging through my veins, urging me forward. Thelma and I stepped out of the car, and she glanced at me, her eyes filled with apprehension. I gave her a small nod, trying to offer some reassurance, though I knew deep down that I was just as scared as she was. We approached the front door, and before I could even raise my hand to knock, it swung open. Gerald stood there, his tall figure blocking the entrance. The smugness on his face, the calm that oozed from him despite the storm that was building in me, made my blood boil. His gaze flickered to Thelma before landing on me, and for a moment, I thought I saw something like fear in his eyes, though it was quickly masked by indifference. "What do you want, Jordan?" he asked, his voice cold and condescending. "I want the truth," I said, my voice low but steady. "I want to know where Sherry is." "Gerald, I know she's here. I've seen her." The words hung in the air, thick with the weight of the accusation. Gerald's face twisted into a sneer, and he crossed his arms, leaning casually against the doorframe. "You're delusional," he said, the words dripping with contempt. "Sherry is dead. We buried her. You need to stop this nonsense before you make things worse for yourself." His words struck me like a punch to the gut. The audacity of his lies was staggering. How could he stand there, so certain of himself, after everything I had learned? Thelma stepped forward, her eyes filled with the truth I could already see in her face. "Stop lying, Gerald," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We know she's alive. You've kept her hidden, manipulated her, and you've been controlling everything. We won't stand by and let you do this anymore." Gerald's face darkened, his calm demeanor finally cracking. He stepped forward, blocking our way as he towered over both of us. The tension in the air was thick, and for a moment, I was sure he was going to lash out. But then, in a moment of sheer arrogance, he smiled almost as if he were amused by our desperation. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Jordan," he said, his voice dripping with menace. "You don't know what I'm capable of. You've been warned. Stay out of it." I could feel the adrenaline surge again, this time fueled by anger. "No, Gerald. This ends now." Thelma and I moved past him, determined to find Sherry, no matter what. But as we walked toward the hallway, Gerald's voice stopped us in our tracks. "You'll regret this," he spat, his eyes burning with malice. "You won't get away with it." I didn't look back. I couldn't. My only focus was on Sherry, and I was willing to risk everything to bring her back. As we made our way through the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. Gerald wasn't going to let us take her without a fight. The air was thick with the weight of his threats. But I couldn't turn back now. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. Sherry was waiting, and no matter what it took, I would find her. As we moved deeper into the house, the atmosphere became oppressive, thick with an unsettling stillness. Every creak of the floorboards under our feet seemed amplified, a reminder that we were trespassing in a place that no longer felt like a home. It was a prison, a mausoleum, both for the secrets it hid and the lives it had destroyed. Thelma was silent beside me, but I could sense her anxiety growing. It was clear that she knew more than she had let on, and though she had stood by me in this confrontation, there was still a hesitation in her eyes. I could feel it. She was afraid of what might happen next. What truths we might uncover that would change everything. "Where is she?" I whispered, my voice tight with urgency. Thelma didn't answer immediately, but there was a flicker of something in her gaze as she glanced around the grand hallway. We were getting closer to the living quarters, the place where Sherry must be. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in on me, as if the house itself was trying to swallow us whole. But nothing, not the mansion, not Gerald, would stop me now. We reached the door at the end of the hall, Gerald's study. It was large, with a dark, oppressive ambience. Much like the man himself. The heavy wooden door was slightly ajar, and the faint sounds of muffled voices drifted from within. I signaled for Thelma to stay behind as I pushed the door open quietly, my heart pounding. The moment I stepped inside, I froze. There, standing by the large bay window, was Sherry. She looked just as I remembered her, though a little thinner, a little more worn by time. She was staring out the window. But when she heard the door creak open, her eyes snapped to mine, wide with fear. "Jordan." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it cut through me like a knife. Before I could take a step toward her, Gerald's voice rang out from the shadows, his presence filling the room with its coldness. "You shouldn't have come here, Jordan. You've ruined everything." I turned, seeing Gerald standing in the doorway, his face twisted in anger. But there was something darker in his eyes, something that chilled me to the bone. The way he stood there, blocking the exit. I realized with a sickening certainty that he was in control of this entire situation. He had kept Sherry locked away for so long, keeping her in the dark, manipulating her every step. "I'm not leaving without her," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through my veins. "You can't keep her here, Gerald. This isn't your life to control." Sherry looked at me with desperation, tears welling up in her eyes. "I tried to tell you, Jordan," she said, her voice trembling. He made me believe you were dead. He made me believe I had to stay here with him. That I was the one who had to pay for what happened." The weight of her words hit me like a freight train. All this time, I had thought she was gone, that she had abandoned me. But it wasn't her choice. Gerald had isolated her, twisted her reality until she had no escape. My heart broke for her. How much she must have suffered. Trapped in this house, alone with only Gerald's lies for company. Gerald's eyes narrowed. "You think you can just waltz in here and take her from me?" he sneered. "She's mine, Jordan. You have no idea what you're up against." His words held a dark promise, and I could see in his eyes that he was willing to do whatever it took to keep her from me. The room seemed to close in around me, suffocating me with the realization that this wasn't just about Sherry anymore. This was about control, power, and the lengths Gerald would go to in order to maintain them. Suddenly, without warning, Gerald lunged at me, and I was thrown off balance. The tension that had been building up finally erupted, and we collided with the heavy desk in the middle of the room. Papers scattered, the sound of wood scraping against wood filling the space. Gerald's strength was overwhelming, his anger gave him power, but I wouldn't back down. In the midst of the struggle, I saw Sherry's face, her eyes wide with fear for both of us. She tried to move toward us, but Gerald shouted at her to stay back, his voice venomous. But Sherry didn't listen. She grabbed the nearest object, what looked like an old vase, and threw it at Gerald with all her strength. The vase hit him in the back, and he staggered forward, momentarily disoriented. This was my chance. I grabbed Sherry's hand, pulling her toward the door. "We're getting out of here," I said, my voice urgent. But as we reached the door, Gerald's voice rang out one more time, filled with rage. "You won't get away with this." I didn't look back. I couldn't. The only thing that mattered was getting Sherry to safety, away from his twisted grip. We ran down the hallway, and I could hear the sound of Gerald's footsteps echoing behind us, growing louder and closer. I didn't know how much longer we had before things got even worse. But for the first time in a long time, I felt like I might finally be able to protect the woman I loved. As we fled through the labyrinth of corridors, my heart thumped painfully against my chest, the weight of everything that had led us here almost unbearable. The sharp tang of fear mingled with the relief that coursed through me at having Sherry by my side again. I couldn't believe she was really here, in front of me. After all these weeks of agony and uncertainty, I had thought I had lost her, that I had no more chances to hold her, to protect her. But now, With her hand tightly clasped in mine, I knew there was no turning back. We had to keep moving. Keep fighting. We reached the grand staircase that led to the front door, and the sound of Gerald's footsteps was now unmistakable, growing louder with every passing second. We couldn't outrun him, not in this house. Not with the way he controlled everything. But as we neared the door, something unexpected happened. The heavy wooden door burst open. And there, standing on the other side, were two uniformed police officers. I froze, not sure whether to feel relief or dread. Had Gerald already called the police? Had he spun some tale to make us the villains? The officers stepped forward, their presence like a protective barrier between us and the chaos of Gerald's world. One of them, a tall officer with a steely gaze, looked at me and then at Sherry. His expression softened when he saw the bruises on her face, the fear still evident in her eyes. "You're safe now," he said, his voice firm but kind. Sherry collapsed against me, her body trembling with the weight of everything she had endured. Her tears soaked into my shirt as she whispered, almost to herself, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jordan. I should have told you. I should have fought harder." I shook my head, brushing the hair from her face, my own heart aching. "No, Sherry. Don't apologize. You didn't deserve any of this. None of it was your fault." I looked at the officers, knowing they would be the ones to bring an end to this madness. They exchanged glances and then moved past us, heading into the house. I could hear their voices rising, demanding answers, telling Gerald to stay put, that he was under arrest. The fear in his voice, the desperation, was a strange comfort to me. For the first time, he was the one who was powerless. I helped Sherry out into the cool night air, where another officer stood by a squad car, waiting for us. He smiled kindly as he opened the door, and I helped Sherry into the car. As the door shut behind her, I turned back toward the house, watching as the police continued to search for any evidence that might expose Gerald's cruelty. For the first time, the house that had once seemed so imposing and full of dark secrets now felt hollow, its power broken. The walls, which had once trapped Sherry in a prison of fear, could no longer hold her. And neither could Gerald. The weight of everything that had happened seemed to come crashing down all at once. The fear, the anger, the confusion, it was all too much. But as I sat beside Sherry in the car, I felt a sense of peace slowly settling over me. We had both survived. We had fought to find each other. And now we were free. We drove in silence for a while, the road ahead stretching out like a promise. The world outside seemed so different, lighter. Somehow, now that we were together again, I could feel the warmth of Sherry's hand in mine, and I couldn't help but think about how fragile life was. How easy it was to take things for granted until they were ripped away from you. Sherry turned to me, her eyes filled with gratitude and sorrow. "I don't know how to make it right, Jordan. I don't know how to fix all the things I've done, all the things I let happen." I squeezed her hand. "You don't need to fix anything. You're here now. And that's all that matters. We have time. We can rebuild. Together." Her smile was faint but real. And for the first time in a long time, I saw hope in her eyes. We still had a long way to go. But we would face it together. Whatever came next, we would face it side by side. Because we had already been through the hardest part. The road ahead was uncertain. But for the first time in months, I felt like we were going to be okay. I could already picture our future. The life we had once dreamed of. And I knew that, no matter what, we would find our way back to each other.